resurrected. Grace is something that God does for undeserving people simply because he loves them. It is something he does out of the counsel of his own will, and it has nothing to do with the will of man. In this way, grace has the same basis as election, although these are different in that election has to do with the order in which men receive their inheritance, as well as their level of authority in the kingdom. Men are not elected to be saved or unsaved forever. The elect are those whom God in his sovereignty has chosen to save first. He is setting up his government in order to prepare the kingdom for the church. Thus we find in Rev. 20:4-6 that these officials of the divine government are raised up first. Not understanding this has caused much friction throughout the centuries between various schools of thought. Those in the past who have recognized God's sovereignty, predestination and election, have often brought it into disrepute by insisting that God deliberately decides not to save 99% of mankind, and then to torture them for all eternity.
Right.
It is little wonder that so few people have been able to stomach such injustice.
Okay.
This has brought the doctrine of election and predestination into disrepute.
Right.
In fact, some years ago a well-known theologian plainly stated that he could not believe in election and predestination, because God's justice would then demand that he reconcile the whole universe unto himself. His analysis was absolutely correct, but he chose to retain the torture theory, rather than Bible truth.
Okay.
But we must at least give this theologian credit for his consistency, unlike, for instance, John Calvin. Calvin taught that God had predestined a tiny few for salvation and predestined the rest for eternal torment. He was inconsistent in that he recognized God's sovereignty in the matter of grace, but then taught it in such a way as to portray God as an unjust tyrant who judges men by a law not found in the writings of Moses.
Right.
To know the mind of God, we must understand both the absolute sovereignty and the absolute justice of God.
Oh my gosh, let's read that again. To know the mind of God, we must understand both the absolute sovereignty of God and the absolute justice of God. There it is in a nutshell. Amen.
Final analysis. We are not saved by faith. We are saved by grace. That is, grace is the basis of our salvation. Works are the result, and between these two things is a great gulf fixed.
Okay.
On the other hand, faith is the bridge between grace and works. Because God has promised to bring all to the land of grace, he will, like a good shepherd, lead all men from the land of their own works, across the bridge of faith. Grace to all is the goal of history. Faith is the narrow bridge leading to that ultimate goal.
How about that paragraph?
In the story of Abraham, we see that first came grace, God's promise. Second came Abraham's faith, for we read that he believed in God.
Okay.
By way of contrast, in the Mosaic covenant, God first required Israel to have faith in him, to believe that their deliverer was indeed the God of the universe who was able to lead them to the promised land. Second came the works, the obedience that naturally followed their faith. With Abraham, it was first grace, then faith. With Moses, it was first faith, then works, obedience. The interesting thing about faith is that it has characteristics of both God's sovereign grace and man's works. Paul associates it with God's sovereign grace by saying, as we read earlier in the 2nd chapter of Ephesians, for by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, 9 not as a result of works, that no one should boast. That is, faith itself is a gift from God and does not originate in the mind or will of man. Yet at the same time God must implant faith into the heart of man by means of his call, or voice, for faith comes only by hearing, Romans 11:17. Faith calls for a response, a decision to follow God, made by the will of man, even as Moses asked Israel to decide. Thus, faith is the most sacred part of the Mosaic covenant and is, in essence, the wellspring of all our works of obedience.
There you go.
It is the first act of obedience toward the life of faith which we, like Israel of old, are expected to perform in our journey to the promised inheritance. Thus, faith is the bridge between grace and works. Abraham.
Thus, faith is the bridge between grace and works. Sounds like neither one of them by themselves is sufficient.
Begins with grace and leads us to faith. Moses begins with faith and leads us to a life of obedience. Paul uses a unique Greek term in Romans 1:5 to express it. In the concordant version, it is translated faith obedience.
Faith obedience.
The word obedience is from the Greek word hupeko, which literally means under hearing.
Okay.
In fact, in both the Hebrew and the Greek, the word for obey is the same as hear. To hear is to obey. Without obedience, there is no true hearing.
Right. Whoa. This chapter is just jam-packed. To